The baseball winter meetings a couple of days away. What are the Brewers going to do there? What's on the top of their agenda? Jack Stern from Brewerfanatic joins us next here on Locked On Brewers.
You are Locked On Brewers, your daily Milwaukee Brewers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Brewers want to improve on their 93 wins and keep their standing in the NL Central, but they're trying to stave off the Joneses, the other teams in the division as well. Baseball winning meetings start on Sunday in Dallas, and for the next few days after that, we'll see if the Brewers make any moves, lay some groundwork, what have you. Jack Stern joins us coming up here in a little bit. Locked On Brewers, brought to you in part by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers, you place a $5 bet and you win it. You get $150 in bonus bets into your account. You win that $5 bet. Easy to do. FanDuel.com to get started today. And a familiar friend of the show, Jack Stern, joining us right now. It is good to get him aboard. And you read his stuff at Brewerfanatic. It's on a few radio stations here in the state of Wisconsin as well. The Score in Appleton, one of those. Jack, appreciate you coming on, and I'm looking forward to these baseball winter meetings coming up here in the next few days.
I am too. I think this is always kind of the time where you start to see the freeze on the offseason, so to speak, thaw out a little bit. We're kind of in this period of time right now for the last few weeks where, aside from the tender deadline and, protecting a few guys from the Rule 5 draft, putting them on the 40-man roster, other than that, there's not a whole lot that happens in November. So this is kind of when you start to see a little bit of action happen. And even if you don't necessarily see a move happen during these winter meetings, this is when a lot of that groundwork gets laid for moves that you see later in the offseason. So one way or another, you're going to start to see the wheels turn a little bit more pretty soon here. It's fun to look forward to.
Nothing really surprised me. I don't know about you, but nothing really surprised me in the tender move. I was surprised, though, Jack. Jake Bauers is not coming back in, and Bryce Wilson. What did and this happened a couple of months ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago. What did you see there with them cutting ties with Wilson and Bauers?
I think the writing was on the wall a little bit for Bryce Wilson because he's a guy who doesn't have minor league options left, and he was starting to become a little bit redundant on this pitching staff. You had some guys who had started to develop now who could fill kind of that Bryce Wilson role. He's a guy who is very useful for helping you get through a regular season because he's not a great pitcher, but if he can give you roughly league average innings or even slightly below league average innings in a variety of different roles, spot starter, long man, you can occasionally throw him in a high leverage spot if you're really tight in the bullpen. There's a lot of value in that, but when you look at the outlook of this pitching staff now, you have Aaron Ashby's back from injury. DL Hall, it's a little bit of a question mark what kind of role he's going to fill. And those are guys who have a little bit more flexibility. DL Hall has an option left, so if the Brewers wanted to, they could move him between the big leagues and AAA. I think the writing was kind of on the wall for Bryce Wilson for a little bit. I think he's just a guy who became a little bit redundant, so the Brewers did him a little bit of a favor and just kind of cut him loose early to give them the chance to just hit the open market now, and he can look for some more opportunities. I would imagine he'd be able to latch on as kind of an innings eater with the rebuilding team. As far as Jake Bauers goes, there's always going to be a cap on your value if you're a guy who's mainly a left-handed first base only type. He can play a little bit of corner outfield as well. And when you're a guy who has struggled at the plate like he did down the stretch, I think it just gets tough to find a spot for that guy moving forward. Is that a guy you really want to take into arbitration as well? Or do you just try to look for the next Jake Bauers instead and see if you can hit on that one instead of keeping the actual Jake Bauers? He was a guy I was really high on going into the season, and for most of the year, he was holding his own in the role the Brewers asked him to fill. He was a very solid bench bat. He was above average as a hitter for much of the season, a little bit of power, got on base a lot. He had a really good eye at the plate, didn't chase pitches out of the strike zone. But eventually down the stretch, the swing and miss just got too bad for him that it was really handicapping his ability to produce. So not exactly surprising to see the Brewers move on from a guy like that who has a pretty vulnerable offensive profile in a role where you kind of do need to hit if you're going to be valuable as a bench first base type.
It appeared for a while last year that he was going to be the first baseman. Went the longest time in the offseason before they signed Rhys Hoskins. It was like Bauers might be the first baseman. Do you see them going out and getting another bat there to couple with Hoskins over at first base?
I think it's possible because when you look at the outlook of this roster right now, they don't really have a clear first baseman behind Hoskins. They've had Andrew Monasterio work out there starting last year.
Mm-hmm.
You do have Eric Haas on the roster as well. He doesn't have a lot of experience over there, but I'm guessing he's a guy who they think might be able to pick up that position in a pinch if they need him to. Tyler Black's kind of the wild card here as well because there always is the possibility that they could slide him into that Jake Bauers type role as a first base DH left field guy off the bench. But if they don't feel comfortable with him in that role, then I think that increases the possibility that they could look for some power there. If I had to guess, it would probably take the form of maybe like a Luke Voigt type signing that we saw a few years ago, where you
Yeah.
guy who's got a little bit of power, bring him in on a minor league deal. And again, that's kind of part of the reason why you don't make a huge effort to keep Jake Bauers. These guys are kind of a dime a dozen. These guys who have been a little bit inconsistent in the big leagues, but there's some upside there with the power. And you see if they can fit in a part-time role. If it doesn't work out, there's really no harm. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that the Brewers have on their radar. It kind of comes down to some of these other pieces that they have on the roster as well, and how they're feeling about those kinds of guys.
We heard rumblings late in the season about Goldschmidt, and obviously he's on the market right now. 37 years old, MVP a couple of years ago. Numbers coming down, hits well in AmFam Field. Do you think with Reese picking up his option, that completely takes Goldschmidt, or do you see a situation where they still might be interested in that guy?
I don't really see it happening. I think it's kind of an awkward roster fit because he's a guy who is also a right-handed bat at first base. He can't play anywhere else. It limits the Brewers a lot. And I think when you're looking at that kind of roster spot, bench spots are obviously limited in Major League Baseball. You need a guy who's able to serve the right purpose for you, or maybe serve multiple purposes in a bench role. So I don't think Goldschmidt really fits the bill. Again, my guess is if they're going to try to add another guy at that position, it would probably be a left-handed bat just to bring a little bit more balance to the roster. Or maybe they pick up like a left-handed multi-positional type guy who can maybe play, third, a little bit of second, a little bit of first as well. That would be a very Brewers type move to try to kill multiple birds with one stone with an acquisition. So those are the kinds of guys I would expect them to go after more so if they want to kind of support Hoskins at that position. I don't think a guy like Goldschmidt is really a fit for them.
And I know Goldschmidt and Hoskins, those guys are kind of one-trick ponies. First base is all they can play. But I was looking at it, maybe would Goldschmidt still be in the picture just for a production matter, and he'd massage that special position over at first base, DH. And I know Yelich has got to play some DH as well. I'm just worried about those 32 home runs that we're going to lose with Adames.
Yeah, and the Brewers are kind of in a tricky spot with that this year. If you look at this free agent market, there are not a lot of sources of power, bona fide sources of power, reliable sources of power that would fit the Brewers' budget. You're right. They are losing over 30 home runs in Willy Adames, and you're not going to be able to replace that from within, and it's going to be tricky to replace that on the free agent market as well. Again, I don't really think Goldschmidt is that kind of guy, because I think when the Brewers build their rosters, they don't always look at it in terms of, here's a specific need we have, so we need to fill that need. They look at their entire roster. They look at it as kind of this dynamic puzzle where all of the pieces can be shifted around to make some other things work as well. I think they're mainly just focused on looking what's out there on the market, seeing kind of the right combination of who's the most cost-efficient guy out there who can help them build the most complete roster. And there's not going to be a single move that exists in isolation. So you're not going to specifically sign Paul Goldschmidt just to try to fill some power and then not really do anything else with the rest of the roster. It's all kind of this big moving puzzle. And that's kind of why the Brewers emphasize guys who can play multiple spots, because it helps them with that moving puzzle. It's a little bit easier to switch some things around and make things work for those kind of guys. So you're right. They do need power. I just don't see Goldschmidt really being the guy you go to there, especially because he's getting up there in age. The aging curve for first baseman is not great. A lot of these guys who are kind of like you talked about, one-trick ponies, when they start getting up there in years, the power can start to go a little bit. The bat speed can start to go a little bit. And I don't know if I necessarily see Goldschmidt as a huge bounce-back candidate given where he's at in his career.
What are the Brewers going to do with the left side of the infield? Well, ask Jack what he thinks coming up after this quick break. Chuck Freeman, Locked On Brewers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day. Good to have you along here on a Friday. Locked On Brewers brought to you in part by Gametime. I mean, Gametime makes it easy if you want to buy some tickets, looking for some concert tickets maybe this weekend or, the next week or so. You're looking to go in a Bucks game. I'll tell you, I get my Brewers tickets on there on a Sunday afternoon. Me and my little kid, he loves going to the games. Shannon as well. Seat views, panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Lowest price guaranteed on Gametime, or they'll credit you 110% of the discount. But that all-in pricing, really, really cool. So you don't get any surprises at the end. But find anywhere you want to go. Bucks games, Packers games, concert tickets, comedy shows, you name it. It's all on Gametime. But you got to download the Gametime app, create an account, use the promo code LOCKEDONMLB. You get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create the account, redeem the code LOCKEDONMLB, LOCKEDON MLB. You get $20 off. You pay $80 for seats, you get $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. What time is it? It is game time. Chuck Freeman here on Locked On Brewers. By the way, Locked On Brewers, you get us on Google, Spotify, Apple, wherever you download your podcast, we are there. And our growing YouTube page. Search Locked On Brewers, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell. That'll alert you every time we drop an episode here on Locked On Brewers. Our guest today is Jack Stern. By Jack Stern is where you get him, STERN. And he's from Brewerfanatic, covers the Brewers on a regular basis. Great having him on the press box for this year. And, of course, years to come, and his great coverage on Brewerfanatic. All right, Jack, what do you think of that left side of the infield? We talked about Adames replacing that power a little bit. I think all indications are it's going to be Ortiz playing that shortstop position, or would they find a shortstop here in the offseason and keep Ortiz over at third?
I think right now the preferred path for the Brewers to take is they want to try to fill third base. That gives them the ability to, like you said, slide Ortiz to shortstop, keep Bryce Terang at second base. Pat Murphy's indicated that that's the way that he would probably prefer to go, but they do kind of face an interesting challenge in making that happen because, to be pretty blunt, this free agent infield market is not good. It's not good at third base. It's not really good at shortstop either behind Adames. It's going to be tough for the Brewers to find the right guy, and it kind of makes me wonder a little bit, are they just going to have to end up playing a little bit more of the waiting game on this infield market? Because when you get past those guys at the top like Adames and Alex Bregman, guys who are very obviously going to be out of the Brewers' price range, you kind of just have this sea of players who are all a little bit above replacement level. They're not great hitters. Their defense ranges from really good to okay. It's just a lot of guys who kind of profile very similarly, and they're probably going to be roughly about the same production. If you're the Brewers, and that's kind of what your options are, do you just end up kind of waiting things out and see which guy ends up falling into your lap, so to speak? And if that's the case, you're going to be looking at some guys who aren't necessarily third basemen. They might honestly profile the best at second base, guys like Brendan Rodgers, Jorge Polanco. And in that scenario, then you're probably going to have to be willing to keep Ortiz at third and slide Bryce Terang to shortstop. I don't think that's the route anyone prefers to go. Ortiz has a little bit of a stronger throwing arm. Mm-hmm. He's got more recent experience at shortstop. He was actually scouted as an even better defender than Bryce Terang at that position. Meanwhile, Terang has become a platinum glover over at second base. But I think it's something the Brewers are going to have to be open to doing. Kind of like what I talked about before with, you kind of have to see things as a moving puzzle instead of just focusing on one way to upgrade or one position to upgrade. The Brewers are going to have to look at this as mainly just we need to add an infielder, not necessarily we need to add a third baseman or we need to add a shortstop. That's going to open up more options for them. It's going to prevent them from overpaying for guys who probably are not going to be amazing players. I think the preferred route, and probably the most likely route still, is they find a third baseman. Either they are able to pick one off of that market, or maybe they get creative with a trade and are able to get a third baseman that way that allows them to move Ortiz over. Terang stays at second base. But it wouldn't surprise me if it goes a different way either, and they kind of have to shuffle those guys a little bit differently to fill things out. But either way, like we talked about before, I don't think they're going to fully be able to replace the power in the infield. They're going to find someone, but I don't think it's going to be an easy task, and we might need to see them get a little bit creative to get it done.
What I don't want, if they play that waiting game, that we see Oliver Dunn over at third base again. I mean, we liked him for a couple of weeks of the season in April last year, and then, he turned into Oliver Dunn again. But That's my only worry about that, if we're just going to put a warm body over at third base again.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about Dunn, what makes him interesting to me is I actually think he's got about as much upside as any of the guys the Brewers could put over there or any of the guys they could get in free agency. Oliver Dunn is a very toolsy player. He hits the ball really hard. He plays good defense. He's got a strong throwing arm at third base. He's got a really good eye at the plate. He never chases out of the strike zone. The problem is he swings and misses a ton in the strike zone, and he's very clearly a guy who needs to get more AAA at-bats before he's ready to handle big league pitching, and I think that's what we saw really hold him back last year when he got an opportunity early in the season. So he's not a guy who I would want to go into the season playing there because, like you said, it was a struggle for him. I don't think he's at the point yet where he's an impact big leaguer. I think he's got the potential to be one if he gets enough reps and makes enough improvement at just making some contact to allow him to tap into those other tools. But right now, you would like to add someone who at least has a little bit of a higher floor over at third base. And I think that's what you could see the Brewers do on this market. Maybe you bring in a guy who, if things don't work out, at the very least, you know that this is a safe guy to put there. He's not going to hurt you at that position. Josh Rojas is kind of someone who comes to mind on that front. I wouldn't say he's a great player, but he gets on base, he draws walks, he plays good defense over at third base. He's a very Brewersy player. He's not going to break the bank. He's not going to light the world on fire. He's probably going to seem like an underwhelming signing, but he's kind of a safe signing because it would prevent you from having to go into the year with a guy like Oliver Dunn, who you really don't know yet if he profiles as a big leaguer right now.
Devin Williams is obviously on that list of things to do in this offseason, whether they're going to keep him or bring him back. What do you see happening there? And maybe here at the winter meetings, or at least maybe laying the groundwork for something in the future with Devin?
I would have to imagine he gets traded this offseason. I've said that pretty consistently for a few months now. Just looking at the way the Brewers operate and the way that the Brewers have to operate if they're going to continue running the kinds of payrolls that they do where they don't go crazy with spending, they need to trade Devin Williams. It's just the best allotment of resources. I'm always a big proponent of trade relievers before their deals expire as well, because the shelf life for a reliever is so short. You see the amount of turnover in even the Brewers bullpen from year to year. Part of the reason their bullpens are so good every single year is because they have a lot of different guys. It's very easy to find breakout relievers. They have short shelf lives. Their peaks can be pretty short. So I don't mind having a lot of turnover there. And when you have a guy like Devin Williams, who is probably not giving you long-term value one way or the other, either he walks in free agency anyway, or if somehow he stayed in Milwaukee, you just never know what can happen and how quickly that peak can end. So just make a move right now, get some value back for him, get some long-term value back for him. I would imagine the Brewers feel the same way. I think it's not so much a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I think if you're the Brewers, you can't afford to drag this out a little bit. You look at what they did with Corbin Burnes last year, where they pretty much put on the public poker face and were talking like he was going to be on their team. And then they made a deal a couple weeks before spring training, and that was what they perceived to be the best deal out there for him. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes on kind of a similar trajectory with Devin Williams, where you play the waiting game for as long as you can to try to get that best offer. And then once we start getting a little bit closer to pitchers and catchers reporting, you make that deal.
Well, this is where it comes back to third base, Jack. I'm wondering if they would, because the Phillies need a closer. Alec Bohm appears to be on the market over there. Maybe something there at all? Would you? And Bohm is kind of one of those guys where, yeah, he had a great first half last year, dipped off in the second. You wonder how he is in the locker room and a few other things there. What do you think of something like that? Not straight up for Bohm, but maybe a little bit of a package deal.
Yeah, you're definitely not the first one to bring that up and raise that as a possibility. I think in terms of just exchanging value, I think it's pretty fair for both sides. Devin Williams, as good as he is, he's a relief pitcher who's going to pitch like 60 innings a year. There is a little bit of a limit to how valuable that is. Alec Bohm, meanwhile, is an everyday third baseman who's not a great player, but he's a solid everyday regular. So I think in terms of value, they come out pretty similar to the point where it makes some sense. Bohm has 2 years of control. Devin Williams just has the one. I'm a little bit worried about whether he's the right fit for this Brewers team and whether the Brewers would be interested in bringing in a 28-year-old who only has 2 more years of control, as opposed to maybe someone a little bit younger who they can try to develop a little more, maybe has better tools than Alec Bohm, especially in the field and on the bases, and maybe he gives you more long-term value. I think it's something that you have to think about. I'm just not a huge believer in Alec Boehm either way. He's been a guy who, before 2024, struggled very seriously on defense to the point where it looked like he couldn't even stick at third base. He definitely got better in that regard in 2024. I'm not sure how much I buy it, though, that he's suddenly a good defender. He's probably still quite a bit below average at that position. So I think it's a guy who has the pop that we've been talking about that the Brewers might want, but there are some other things about the profile that have me wondering if it's just not the direction they're going to go. It wouldn't really seem like a very Brewers-like move to me.
Will the Brewers make any surprise moves here in the offseason? Something that'll catch us very un-Brewer-like, we should say. We'll get to that. We'll ask Jack about that. Coming up next, Chuck Freeman here on Locked On Brewers. Locked On Brewers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day. FanDuel, get ready to tackle the NFL season here. And, college playoffs are coming up. Got the conference championship games over the weekend. The number one sports book in America is FanDuel. FanDuel gives you something you need to place live bets on the NFL. Maybe you like the Lions yesterday when they got down against the Pack. That would have been a good play. You could have got a better pick 'em there if you checked out FanDuel. View the live play-by-play. Check out the latest stats and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Go to FanDuel.com today, and you get started with $150 in bonus bets. When you win that first $5 bet, you place a bet, you win it for $5. Well, you're going to win. You're going to get $150 placed into your account with FanDuel. But as I mentioned, they're especially the live plays. Go to the live plays, especially in the NFL. You see what you like there. And wow, you're going to take the underdog here. Like I said, with the Lions, they got down by 21-17 last night, and you're thinking, okay, maybe the Lions are they going to keep this winning streak going. They're going to rally here. Well, you would have had them in a pick 'em if you would have played it on FanDuel last night. Again, that first $5 bet, you win it. You get $150 in bonus bets placed into your account. FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner, sportsbook partner of the NFL. Chuck Freeman here on Locked On Brewers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day. Great to get Jack Stern on today from Brewerfanatic, enjoying his offseason as well. We're all getting ready for the baseball winter meetings coming up in San Antonio beginning on Sunday. As I mentioned before the break, Jack, any unlike Brewer moves you see made in the offseason? Are they going to surprise us for a change this offseason?
I'm not really counting on it. It kind of depends on what you would define as a surprise move. If you're talking about maybe a bigger splash in free agency or via trade, I'm going to say probably not. It's a little bit harder to tell via trade sometimes, though, because you never would have guessed a few years ago that William Contreras would be available for the price the Brewers paid for him, the very modest price the Brewers paid for him. But other than that, I don't really see anything crazy happening on the free agent front. I think you're going to see just some cost-effective free agent deals, maybe a couple here and there. But other than that, I don't think you're going to see anything crazy. And again, when you're talking about those kinds of moves, those aren't necessarily always moves that are going to happen during the winter meetings. The winter meetings is when you might see some of the bigger fish move. And then, like I said before, that kind of sets things in motion and opens up some more possibilities for the Brewers. So if I had to guess, I don't think it's going to be a crazy busy week for them. I don't think the offseason as a whole is going to have a ton of surprises for us, unless maybe they decide to flip one of their outfielders or something like that. But otherwise, I think you're going to probably see a pretty standard Brewers offseason and a good chunk of this team from 2024 returning and kind of being in similar roles.
They do have a surplus in the outfield there. Do you think they might get rid of or trade one of those young guys in a deal?
I think it's possible. It always depends on what's out there for them. I know we talked about Tyler Black before. I think that he's a guy who is a trade candidate, especially if they don't really like him in the bench role that he would probably presently occupy, maybe supporting Rhys Hoskins at first base. Another way they could choose to go that might not shock me is if they trade one of their current outfielders to open a spot for Tyler Black in the outfield as a left-handed bat. They could do that as well. Guys like Sal Frelick or Garrett Mitchell, depends on how the Brewers are feeling about those guys. Mitchell is always a tricky one to kind of put your finger on because he's got a very interesting profile in terms of what he's really good at and what he really struggles at as a hitter. So it's always tough to kind of try to project how the Brewers are feeling about him and how other teams might feel about him as a trade piece. But I'm sure those are the kinds of discussions you can expect the Brewers to be having right now and to continue to have over the offseason. Otherwise, though, I don't think anything crazy is really on the horizon.
Jack, the Brewers obviously the team that everybody wants to catch in the division. What team do you think is going to make the biggest move to close the gap or maybe even overtake the Brewers in this division?
It's kind of tricky to think about because you look at the outlook of this division. The Cardinals sound like they're taking a little bit of a step back, so I don't think they're going to do anything to try to catch the Brewers. The Cubs, I think, still could, but then you hear about them trying to offload Cody Bellinger's salary or trying to offload, say, a Suzuki's salary. So you kind of wonder a little bit where they're at. I think they are a team that probably should be trying to catch the Brewers because I think they can do it if they make some smart moves. The Pirates are kind of a wild card team for me because that pitching staff is shaping up really, really nicely, the young talent they have there. I think if they add the right bats, they could be a threat, but at the same time, recent history is telling us that the Pirates aren't great at picking the right bats to add, so I'm not sure if I would necessarily consider them a threat. I think the Cubs are really the only one right now. Maybe the Reds do something, but otherwise, it's kind of the similar outlook for this division as we had for much of the season, where the Brewers were kind of running away with things, and then every other team, you could see a path by which they could be a threat to the Brewers, but it was never really coming together, and you had a pretty good feeling about Milwaukee staying at the top.
Jack, let's catch up later on in January. How about that? Love getting you on.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks, Chuck.
All right, that's Jack Stern. Follow him on Twitter by Jack Stern. Always very active on Twitter, and of course at Brewerfanatic. This is Chuck Freeman. Follow us on Google, Spotify, Apple, #1 Brewer podcast on the internet. Wherever you download your audio podcasts, we are there. And of course, our growing YouTube page, search Locked On Brewers. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, hit the alert. That'll alert you every time we drop an episode here on Locked On Brewers. My name is Chuck Freeman. For your second listen on Locked On Network, turn on my guy Sully, Locked On MLB. He's got all the offseason news every day on Locked On MLB. This is Chuck Freeman, Locked On Brewers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day.